establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many indigenous nations. The area known as Tookorongo has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many indigenous people. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. A couple of announcements before we get started today. For all of the students in the room, make sure you sign the attendance. If you are here for 6 of our lunchtime talks, you receive a certificate. If you're here for 10 or more over the course of the academic year, then you're eligible for our honors certificate. At the end of each of our lunchtime talks, we also have a book draw. So that's another reason you should be signing the attendance sheet. And then to remind everyone, we have a weekly quiz, and the winner receives a gift certificate for the York University Bookstore. Some further news, our Freshers Concert has been rescheduled. It was scheduled for this evening. It's going to be rescheduled for Thursday, February the 6th. Please make a note of that. Our McLaughlin College Community Choir will be having its first performance, its debut performance on December the 4th for our holiday luncheon. So please come out to the holiday luncheon and you'll have an opportunity to hear some wonderful music sung by our McLaughlin College Community Choir. The only community choir, incidentally, here at York University. We have a number of outstanding choirs, but this is the first community choir. And as some of you probably know, one of our distinguished fellows, Professor Stephanie Martin, who's the graduate director in the Department of Music, who's the chair of our board for the community choir. She's an expert on community choirs, so we couldn't have a better person who's really behind this and leading it. So today, no stranger to McLaughlin College, one of our noted fellows who's been a fellow for a number of years at McLaughlin College, Dr. Joseph Rikhoff, who's with the Faculty of Common Law at the University of Ottawa, where he teaches a course on international criminal law. And Joseph, thank you very much for coming down here all the way from Ottawa today. We're just talking about via rail and the advantages of coming by rail as opposed to driving or flying. He retired from the Canadian Government Department of Justice as a senior counsel with the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes section. And he's continued, and as he told me this morning, he's probably busier now than he was before he was retired. Continues to do outstanding research and publications in this field. He has over 50 publications to his credit and a number of very distinguished journals in the field. He's published The Criminal Refugee, the treatment of asylum seekers with a criminal background in international and domestic law. I think he's working on the 2nd edition of that book right now. He's co-authored with Robert Curry, International and Transnational Criminal Law, and he's co-authored with George Anderson, A Theory of Punishable Participation in Universal Crimes, and that publication came out in 2018. It's available as a free download, and we're very happy and honored to help launch that book last year at McLaughlin College. Today he'll be talking about Syria, crimes and punishment. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Joseph Rikhoff.
Thanks again for inviting me and such a nice introduction, James. It's always nice to be here and share ideas. Usually I talk more specifically about what I know and can share with international criminal law, I decided for this particular topic to broaden the issue, and I will not talk very much, unless people ask questions about it, about the concepts of war crimes against humanity and genocide, or for that matter terrorism. I'm going to talk about what has happened in terms of dealing with people who have committed what I call heinous crimes in Syria since 2011. Not to say that bad things don't happen beforehand under the regime of al-Assad, they definitely did, but things have accelerated and gotten much worse since 2011. I'll give you a couple of statistics, which are, each of them are horrendous in themselves, and in combination they're just too difficult to contemplate. As you know, since 2011, since March 2011, when people in Syria started to demonstrate for more freedoms, since that time when those demonstrations morphed into suppression by the Syrian government, into all-out war between Syrian government, opposition parties, and parties supported by international countries such as the United States and Russia on both sides of the conflict. At one point in time, I understand there were about over 50 different groups fighting each other or fighting on behalf of the Syrian government or the opposition. And most of those groups have engaged at one point in time in war crimes against humanity, and one of them, ISIS, also genocide. There's no doubt by any experts that what ISIS did to the Yazidi population amounts to genocide. Sometimes it's difficult to assess whether an event amounts to genocide because you require the perpetrators to specifically target a population for extermination. But ISIS has been very upfront in social media and other media to say they wanted indeed to wipe the Yazidi off the face of the earth. So you have that component is already established. So I don't want to talk about those things too much in terms of statistics. As it stands right now, and I have an expert in the room who can by all means correct me if I'm wrong about things, but I understand that over 500,000 people killed or presumed killed since 2011. 5 million people have left Syria to go to other countries, specifically Europe, and another 5 million have been internally displaced. So those are one of the worst events that we have known in the world since the Second World War. What I will be looking at is what has happened, what has been the reaction by international community, both at large and by individual countries, to actually deal with perpetrators of those crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. And there's been a lot of work done. As a matter of fact, in terms of the work being done, I think that Syria might be the situation whereby the amount of information gathered, information shared among countries, among international organizations, amongst NGOs, probably surpasses everything that has gone before in terms of documenting crimes committed in Syria. And it has been done by traditional means, by getting witness statements. There's a couple of NGOs. One is called the Center for Accountability and Justice. That actually have people smuggling out documents from Syria that they now store at a safe place in Lisbon. But also there have been some very innovative ways of gathering evidence. There's an NGO in the United States that actually has equipped people in Syria who witnessed atrocities to not only record it on a special phone, but as soon as recorded, the information is uploaded to a satellite and downloaded to a server in the United States. But what is recorded immediately disappears from the phone, so it cannot be traced in case they are being questioned about it. So a lot of new technologies. The fact that new technologies, that quite a lot of perpetrators have used Facebook to actually record the things they've committed, has helped investigators to actually investigate and lay charge against those people. There have been a number of people who have been charged in Europe for actually videotaping themselves in the act of committing atrocities or in the act of posing with people being killed or tortured and pose that. As a matter of fact, there's a program that I saw when I still work in the government, which still astonishes me, that somehow a European government was able to record or find a number of those trophy videos on Facebook or social media, which is not that complex. But then they were able to somehow compare those social media posts with more recent posts of people having come to Europe and took other pictures of themselves. So they could compare, say, okay, now the picture of this person standing by a dead body, holding as a trophy, and 2 years later, I'm going to picture this person living in France, for instance, and that's how they can start investigations. So there's some very innovative methods of actually investigating those kind of crimes. So what I want to talk about today, for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then there's questions, is what has happened in taking people, holding people responsible for crimes committed in Syria. Now, with any war crimes event situation, and I've worked in this area for quite a long time, all you can do in terms of enforcing the law dealing with international crimes, you can at best scrape the surface of what has happened. If you look, for instance, at the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, the ICTY, they put on trial, and they've been the most successful international criminal institution dealing with war criminals. They put on trial in the 20 years of existence, 161 people. If you know that in former Yugoslavia there have been estimated to have been at least 10 to 20,000 perpetrators, let alone another 500,000 victims, it's scratching the surface. But I'll get back to that later, like how that could work in terms of a division of labor. So what I'm going to tell you now has been happening so far is by no means a solution. It's by no means putting everybody on trial involved in criminal activities. For one thing, a lot of the people involved in criminal activities are still in Syria. And it's very difficult to gather evidence there at the moment. Like the people who did for this organization in Portugal, they did it in effect by putting their lives at risk, by taking pictures or taking documents from destroyed buildings and smuggling them out of Syria. People have been caught and have been paid a ultimate price. It's very difficult to investigate. And in the past, international criminal institutions investigated crimes. They typically did it after a peace arrangement had been reached, like say in former Yugoslavia. There was at least a ceasefire in former Yugoslavia. Rwanda, the war had ended. Sierra Leone, the war had ended. So people who go in afterwards investigate after this relative peace and quiet. The most recent institution, the International Criminal Court, has gone into areas of ongoing conflict. And it has been very difficult, to the extent that some investigators have been arrested by local warlords and had to be negotiated to release them. So it's much more difficult to gather evidence for criminal prosecutions in an ongoing conflict. So there's one complicating factor, very complicating factor in Syria. So what has happened? I'll start by first talking about what happened at the international level, and then we'll talk about the national level. Primarily it happened in Europe, but also happened locally in the Middle East, especially in Iraq and in Syria itself, like in the area that is occupied by the Kurdish Defense Forces. But also this has been happening in Canada. In case you get your hopes up about Canada, I can tell you not much, but some things have happened. And I will span the activities, like I will not limit myself to discussion about war crimes, carrying humanity, genocide, because a lot of investigation prosecutions have been done in the area of anti-terrorism. And I can discuss later what the difference and the overlap are, but the number of vehicles being used to put people on trial. So speaking internationally, I mentioned the International Criminal Court just a minute ago. And while that court has been in existence over 20 years now and has investigated or is investigating at least 20 different situations, mostly in Africa, but also now in Europe and Asia. Like they recently, the prosecutor got the okay to investigate the situation of the Rohingya in Myanmar. That only happened last week. So they are investigating a number of situations. However, they are not investigating anything happening in Syria. The reason is very particular to the statute they operate under, called the Rome Statute. When the statute was negotiated in 1998 in Rome, there were a number of countries which were very concerned that the International Criminal Court would impinge on their sovereignty. So they made clear that the ICC has only quite limited jurisdiction to investigate. And the basis of investigation is typically that they can only prosecute people who are nationals of the nationals of a country which has signed on to their own statute. While 122 have done so, some very powerful places have not. The United States has not signed on, Russia hasn't signed on, China has not signed on, Israel, India, Pakistan, and Syria. Syria has not signed on either. So as a result, the ICC cannot investigate any national of Syria because it's not part of the statute. There's one exception. The ICC statute has one exception whereby it can investigate nationals of any state. But an exception requires the referral by the Security Council of the United Nations. And as you all know, the Security Council has 5 permanent members who all of each one has a veto. And at one point in time, there was virtual consensus to refer a situation to the ICC by Security Council. They did that in 2011 for Libya. And when Gaddafi fell, the Security Council referred the situation to ICC because every Security Council member, all 15, agreed, and at that time China and Russia abstained, did not veto it, they did not vote in favor, which is fine, you can go ahead. In Syria, when they last voted, there were 10 votes recorded. Of those 10, so was 10 votes in favor, but Russia abstained for obvious reasons. So as a result, the ICC, at this point in time, cannot do anything in terms of bringing people to justice under their realm. Now, on the international law, so international history, there have been a number of variants of empowering international institutions to deal with war criminals. The first ones was the ICTY in 93, then the ICTR for Rwanda in 94 followed, and they are sort of like the Cadillac version of international institutions. Because they had Security Council, they established by the Security Council, so they had very strong powers. They had powers to actually force states indirectly to cooperate. ICC doesn't, for instance. So they were quite successful. As I said, the ICTY died and prosecuted 161 people, the ICTR 110. Again, it's a drop in the bucket, but at least they did something. And they put on trial the most responsible people, as they call it, the people most influential, because they want to use the resources wisely and only put on trial people who are most responsible, who are like movers and shakers and up in the hierarchy. But it was very expensive because the money came directly out of the United Nations budget. And at one point in time, in the early 2000s, almost a quarter of the entire United Nations budget was going to those institutions, those two institutions. The United Nations said, too expensive, find another way of dealing with criminals. So they established what they call internationalized tribunals. And they were established for Sierra Leone and for Cambodia. And typically, there was 2 aspects of those institutions. While the ICTR had virtually only international personnel, international judges, and international people serving in the prosecutor's office, the Sierra Leone Special Court and ACC had a mix of national and international personnel. Secondly, they were not paid by the United Nations. They were actually paid by countries who has signed up to support it. Special contributions, like Canada has supported both. But at one point in time, the ECCC, this is one from Cambodia, ran out of money, and they had to go begging, like hand in hand, to get more money to actually continue operating. That is the downside of having an operation whereby you rely on voluntary contributions. So that was the next step. Then you got institutions who operated on regional auspices. You have a special chamber of the Senegalese courts that put on trial Habre from is it from now? I forgot now. But this was specially set up, and there were like all regional personnel, also international judges, but all from Africa. It's also happening, by the way, in Europe with a specialized chamber to deal with crimes committed in Kosovo since 1998. So this is the next one. What happened in Syria, so there's been a lot of talk about creating a special tribunal along the lines of the one for Sierra Leone and along the lines of the one for Cambodia, to establish one for Syria. Sweden floated a proposal early this year in some other European countries, some support by Germany, some support by the Netherlands, saying they wanted a special court, but only to try ISIS members. It was done partially because it was politically easier to have a court that deals with just the people who everybody is convinced were the worst of the worst. 2 weeks ago, a number of NGOs in Europe wrote a letter to the Swedish government saying, you know, that is not a good idea. We should have a tribunal that deals with all atrocities committed in Syria, not just ISIS, also the government, also groups associated with governments or with ISIS, especially, say, Al-Qaeda groups, like the ones called Al-Nur. So that debate is still going on. There's a number of questions that have been raised about it. One, where would you base it? The ICTR, ICTR were both based outside the location where the crimes occurred, but Sierra Leone Special Court and the ECC in Cambodia were actually based in the area where the crimes occurred. But of course, in those situations, they occurred a long time ago, so it's easy to establish this. So the question has been, okay, where shall we base this tribunal? Syria looks impossible, like Syria proper. To base it in the Kurdish occupied territory is also problematic, has been said, because one, the Kurdish, I won't say state, but the Kurdish entity has no status in international law that actually would allow it to welcome international organization. Apart from the fact that Syria would probably oppose, especially Turkey would oppose to have anything that is controlled by the Kurds in Syria. So the question is, what about Iraq? Maybe in the Kurdish area in Iraq, maybe base it there. That is one thing that's being looked at right now. Then who would then be the personnel dealing with it, like be put on that tribunal, given the very insecure security situation in both Syria and still Iraq as well. And then lastly, typically when you have an arrangement with a country, because like both Sierra Leone and Cambodia, the tribunal was set up as a result of agreement with the United Nations and a particular country, which means you also incorporate a number of aspects of the national law where the tribunal is based. Now the big stumbling block in Iraq is that Iraq, first of all, in its national law does not have crimes against humanity or war crimes. But secondly, and more importantly, they have the death penalty. And when they negotiated the ICTR for Rwanda, it also had a death penalty. And actually, the Rwanda opposed international tribunal, which was set up to deal with the victims of the genocide in Rwanda, and the government said, we don't want to participate because you do not have the death penalty. They changed their mind afterwards, but there could be a big political issue for Iraq. So at the moment, there are a lot of thoughts going around, but nothing is certain. Not to say that nothing has happened internationally, there's actually a whole new model of dealing with international crime that was created in 2017 the United Nations General Assembly created what is called an IIIM, Independent International Investigative Mechanism. It was created, and then the first one in 2016, it was 16, no, it was 18, sorry, 18, was for Syria. A year later it was followed by a IIM for Iraq. And this year, or late last year, there's also an IIM established to investigate the situation of the Rohingya in Myanmar. So it's becoming a trend. And the reason they have now those IIMs internationally, first of all, they're cheap. Because they don't have judges, they don't have prosecutors, they only have investigators. So their mandate is to investigate, find evidence of crimes committed in Syria, Iraq, and in Myanmar, and then pass on that evidence to somebody else. It could be an international organization that's been set up, but most so far they pass information to national states to use information for their local prosecutions. So it's cheap. It is also a whole lot less politically sensitive because they typically investigate so far from afar. They haven't gone to Syria or Iraq, for instance. And more like, for instance, when they set up the IIM for Syria, 110 countries supported it as a principle. So it's politically a little bit less sensitive than creating a tribunal. There's also less of a structure. There's less of things you have to worry about how the mains you set it up. So the IIM for Syria has now reported 4 times to the General Assembly, setting out the progress so far. And they have engaged with states, have engaged with other United Nations organizations, specifically the Human Rights Council, which has its own investigative body, and also with NGOs. So there's a good interaction in getting evidence. They were supposed to actually submit some concluded files, like actually having information about individuals that could be then given to somebody else. So far they've been looking at generally a situation, generally an area. They've been doing what they call structural investigations. What it means is typical investigation, internationally or domestically, you start investigating when you get information about a person. Like for instance in Canada, when I was working for the war crime section, somebody might contact us by mail, by phone, whatever, saying, there's somebody living in my neighborhood, I'm convinced this person is a bad person from Rwanda. I want to investigate. That was usually the lead on which, both internationally and domestically, investigations started. But a couple of years ago, Germany decided on a different track, and I will come back to that, but in terms of investigations. They decided we're going to do structured investigations. In other words, we become more proactive. You're not going to wait for complaints from people who say, you know somebody who's been in a war criminal in whatever country, like Syria, actually, Syria. They said, at the moment, there are over 1 million Syrian refugees in Germany. They must know stuff. Let's go out and proactively approach this community and say, what do you know of situation in Aleppo? What do you know of the situation in Damascus? So they've been getting a lot of information from people reacting to a request by the German government, the German worker prosecutor, and saying, give them information. And then they collate it, they look at it, and then from those, the information, then they pick the best cases. I'm going to get back to that in a minute. So the IIM is taking a similar approach. As opposed to taking waiting for complaints about individuals, they look at bigger situations and find whatever they found a situation, and then they narrow it down to individuals in particular regions. It's also done a little bit by ICC, but this is much more revolutionary. And other countries will follow the same example. So that is happening so far internationally. I should also point out that a number of NGOs have been very active as well. I mentioned the one in Portugal. There have been other ones as well in various countries, and they collect information as well. And they interact either with domestic authorities or with this IIM. So there is definitely a convergence of information. Like it's not as dispersed as it used to be in other situations. So that brings me from the international level to the domestic level. And there are two approaches which are nothing new. They happen in every situation. First, you have investigations and prosecutions happening domestically in the area, in the country where crimes were committed, which is typically called territorial jurisdiction. This is the most common way of investigating. Canada, virtually all crimes investigated, prosecuted, and happened in Canada. Now, that can also be used for international crimes. Now, the obvious candidate so far to deal with criminal activities in Syria would be Syria itself. But there's no structure in place to actually prosecute. The only structure in place right now is again in the Kurdish-held area where they have set up prisons specifically for ISIS again, and they actually guard the prisoners. They have not processed any people in those prisons for criminal prosecutions, as far as I know. What has happened is that a lot of people, either by the Kurdish groups in eastern Syria, but also by a number of Western countries, they have transferred their nationals to Iraq. A lot of people involved in Syria, I'm talking primarily about ISIS now, like ISIS members, they have found their way, or they're being forcibly transferred to Iraq. And Iraq has put on trial over, I think, 5,000 ISIS members. When I say trial, I mean that with a big grain of salt. There was an article recently in the New Yorker, where a reporter went there, and a typical trial takes 3 to 4 minutes. And they're based typically on evidence obtained by torture beforehand. And so a judge will give a decision like 20 cases a day. So that is not the kind of justice that we understand. So in terms of human rights concerns, in terms of fairness, there are a lot of trials there, but they're quite tainted. Plus, there's this additional issue, and please, I might be wrong here. ISIS members were primarily Sunni, is that correct? The judges are primarily Shiite, which invariably have had personal experience to ISIS members and not pleasant ones. So they are not necessarily very unbiased. So all taken together, it's not a particular good situation from a human justice perspective. But it's there, and I'll come back later on what it means for possible solutions. What you have seen, or what I should say, at the moment, in the Kurdish occupied territory, so to speak, there are still 10,000 ISIS members being held in various prisons, mostly 3 prisons. Of those 10,000, 800 are European ISIS fighters, and 1,200 from other countries other than Syria and Iraq. So there's a large component of foreign fighters still being held in Kurdish prisons. And there's been an example whereby a number of those fighters in Kurdish prisons were transferred to Iraq either with connivance of European countries or the encouragement. There's been a big kerfuffle whereby France allowed 11 of the nationals, all ISIS members, to be transferred forcibly to Iraq, where they faced on those trials just mentioned, all with the death penalty. Haven't been executed yet, but it's like it was said, well, France actually facilitated in getting us to Iraq, and by doing so almost committed a crime himself by not knowingly allowing an unfair trial. So it's really a complex factor, because what you see is European and North American countries today are very hesitant to repatriate their foreign fighters from Syria. And there are 2 sides of the story. The one side is, from a human rights perspective, they're being kept in terrible prisons in East Syria. They if they face trials, might take a long time, and the trials, I said, are very unfair. That's the one side. The other side is, some of them could very well be hardened ISIS criminals. If you bring them back to your countries, like Europe or North America, you might increase the security risk in your own country. So what do you do? There's a dilemma that European countries are now being faced with. And there's a couple, and by the way, when I say ISIS members, I also include, there have been a lot of ISIS wives there, and of course children who were born to ISIS parents. And the way to do this repatriation has been different. Germany and France, which by the way took in the largest number of Syrian refugees in 2015, 2017, like Germany over 1 million, France over 500,000, Sweden also 800,000. So a lot of people have gone there. And so there's a connection there now, but France and Germany have been very active in repatriating at least the children and some of the wives. If they have evidence that the wives were not involved in ISIS direct activities, which is, as I understand it, quite unlikely, because the wives were treated quite traditionally under the ISIS regime. So most wives are most likely innocent of committing crimes. So they're being quite active in repatriating children and women, especially if it's the women with the children being coming back. And so far, 16 countries have repatriated children and women, mostly children, especially orphans. On the other hand, a country like the United Kingdom has a very harsh stand. They said we will not allow anybody back. And as you probably know from this last case, even a person who has British citizenship, has dual citizenship, they revoke citizenship. So even if you had a right to come back, that right will take away from you. So you won't be able to come back legally, let alone practically. So, and Canada's situation as well. I'll come back to Canada in a minute, so what they've been doing in terms of dealing with people who have involved in ISIS and who are still out in the Middle East. But going back, what's happening nationally in the other aspect of dealing with war crimes, humanity, genocide, and terrorism is when you can also prosecute people in a country where the crimes were not committed. Like Canada, we can prosecute a number of crimes which were committed outside Canada. Not as many, maybe about 10 or 12, typical terrorist crimes, international crimes. And it means that if you commit them outside Canada, then Canada has authority, when you come to Canada, to actually put you on trial for some international terrorist crimes. The same happens in Europe. A lot of countries in Europe have this extraterritorial jurisdiction, where they can put people on trial for committing crimes outside the territory where they either ended up or where they lived. So what you've seen since 2015, there have been a large number, and by large, I should put this in context. When we talk about war crimes trials based on this extraterritorial jurisdiction, we're not talking about large numbers. I looked at it recently. 15 countries who are on the forefront of using this kind of legal device, 13 in Europe and 2 in North America, United States and Canada. In total, since 2005, they have totally put on trial 70 people, 70. It's a very small number. The reason being, imagine if you have to go to get evidence outside Canada, outside Germany, each time it's expensive, it's very resource intensive, and you have to also get used to different cultures to obtain evidence. So 70 looks like the most active country in dealing with international crime has been the Netherlands. They have done so far 12 people since the early 2015. So in this context, when I talk about ISIS-related crimes, there have been almost total about 70. Since 2015, Europe has put on trial almost a third of this total of 70. Almost almost half, almost 30. And I mentioned Germany earlier. Germany has been extremely active because of the structural approach. They put a trial so far over 24 people involved somehow in Syria. And they have used either war crimes allegations or terrorism allegations. Because in Germany, you put somebody on trial before being a member of a terrorist organization, which is not difficult to do. Now, I will not go into detail of each of the countries, what they have done. I have information with me if you want to look at it, but I just want to sort of look at some trends coming out of those investigations in countries like Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, the Netherlands, and Spain. And some trends you see. First of all, the number of people investigated and then put on trial is almost directly as a direct correlation between the number of people who fled to those countries. The fact that Germany is so active is because they had the largest number of people fleeing Syria to come to Germany. Typically, in any refugee stream that comes to a country, you will find a number of people who might face persecution, but were also criminals before they came to this country. So there's a correlation between the number of refugees in a country and the number of people you find who will be criminals. It's not a strong correlation because in other research that I've done, the number of people in a refugee stream that might end up have a criminal background is less than 0.1%. We're talking about very small numbers. But if you have 1 million, you're talking about 10,000. So I mean, it does add up in large numbers. So that's why Germany was able to find a lot of criminals. That's one trend. The second trend is that the kind of people we investigated spans the spectrum. They investigated ISIS members. They investigated Al-Qaeda affiliated organizations. They have investigated members of the Al-Assad regime, investigated members belong to Al-Assad associated groups. So they have the whole spectrum. There's like, in the span of 2 weeks, there was one decision whereby an ISIS member was convicted of, I believe it was torture, and a member of the Syrian forces holding an ISIS member's head for a camera. So they do not distinguish who you are, but what you have done. Now, not to say that the majority of people that have been convicted so far in Germany and other countries have been people related to either ISIS or other terrorist organizations. The reason being is, one thing, there are in those countries people who are like still associated with the Assad regime have no reason yet to leave. Some might, but on the whole, they probably see that the tide is turning in their favor, so why should they leave? However, having said that, the people that have been investigated or prosecuted, also the background varies. Some people came as refugees. Some people were like nationals who became foreign fighters. But also, especially Al-Assad regime investigated, and actually the people were not in those countries, but they laid charges and issued international warrant of arrest. So if this person does leave Syria and goes to a country that gets an Interpol warrant, they have to hand it over to Germany or other countries. So there's a whole spectrum of people that they have looked at. And interestingly, in France, they've actually laid charges against 2 French companies who had dealings in Syria. One company, what's called Omni. That's the second one. That's Lavage. Lavage is a cement company. And they were charged with actually paying protection money to ISIS, among other things. Like they had, and gave them all the revenue, where all they give revenue. Now what stands right now is that as of last week, the indictment, the complaint was filed by an NGO. And it was based on crimes against humanity, like a direct involved crime against humanity, terrorism, and also voiding of sanctions. Last week, the war crimes charges were dropped by a court. They left intact the terrorism charges and the charges of evading international sanctions. The other one, I forgot the name, but they were actually charged of being investigated for providing surveillance equipment to the Al-Assad regime. So, now, on the whole, you don't see it very often. Corporate cases are very difficult to prosecute, investigate. We tried myself when I was still working for the government, extremely difficult. So they got this far in France, it's something to be recommended. The third trend is the type of charges laid. As I said, war crimes cases are very, very difficult to do because you have to get evidence abroad, from witnesses abroad. But a number of countries have actually charged people for very specific war crimes, not used at all since the Second World War, namely the willful defacing of a human corpse. And those are those Facebook pages. Easy to prove that people have a Facebook page standing beside somebody who was killed, holding their head out and being decapitated, or doing other atrocious things to a dead body. That's a war crime. So they're being convicted of those kind of war crimes more than once. The downside is it's one of the least serious war crimes. It is reflected in the punishment. Like if you typically for a war crime case, like in Canada, you get like imprisonment. In Europe, typically you get like between 15 and 30 years. That war crime, perpetrators got some between like 16 months and 3 years. Like it's very in the low end. So then the person will be released, and then what? Right? So that's what's happening in some of this. There's another trend. That's about it. So those trends you can see that happening there. I'm going to end now because I'm almost running out of time. What has Canada done in this context? Canada has done very little. And before you say, well, bunch of deadbeats, there's a reason for it. Unlike the uncontrolled refugee movement in Europe, in North America it was very controlled. In the United States, nobody will be let in. Trump started out saying, no people from Muslim countries to begin with. I'm paraphrasing. But then it became like broadened, but still very few people can come in to the United States at all, including people from Syria. In Canada, since 2015, Canada has allowed in process over 65,000 people who were Syrian refugees. And it's well known, being like reported. But the way it was done is, the people who were let in were very carefully vetted to ensure they would have not been involved in crimes, to ensure that they would actually make good Canadian citizens. So because there were like millions they could choose from. And also be very careful, what Canada did in terms of policy, especially the first wave of 30,000, they looked at refugees who've been living either in Lebanon or Jordan for over a decade. So in other words, they had no involvement whatsoever in the Syrian conflict in 2011. They were like very low risk to process. The downside has been that a lot of those people who've been living in Lebanon and Jordan for a while were originally farmers in Syria, so they have difficulty adjusting to Canadian culture at the moment. But all to say is, because of the very serious vetting and the parameters set, there have been no cases in Canada at the court level of people involved in terrorism or war crimes allegations in Syria. There's been one case that got publicity of a person, because not only can Canada, like any other country, put people on trial for involvement in international crimes, they can also process them during a refugee or migration hearing. And that's called either inadmissibility, immigration, or exclusion of refugees. Which means if somebody is found to be excluded or found admissibility, the person will be deported back to his own country when it's safe to do so. But they do not face a criminal penalty. Now, in one case in Canada, which got some public attention, there was a person who lived in Lebanon, close to the Syrian border, and on a regular basis was, he says, forced by ISIS to go to the Syrian site and fix ISIS cars. He was a mechanic. And that person was excluded, will have held an appeal, and was heard by the federal court, this is the ultimate appeal, on September 21st. There's no decision. It's the only case in Canada dealing with people who have come from Syria to Canada as part of the refugee processing. What we have seen more often in Canada is Canadians who went or want to go to Syria as foreign fighters. And on the and that is being dealt with under the Canadian anti-terrorism legislation. And the legislation is very broad, like virtually anything you do except being a member, you can be prosecuted. And the provision mostly used, so almost always used, is 4 provisions which were added to the criminal code not too long ago, which means leaving Canada with the intention to join a terrorist group, with the intention to facilitate a terrorist group, with the intention to participate in a terrorist group, and the intention to assist a terrorist group. And 10 people have been put on trial for that provision. They're all Canadians, but they all went to Syria or wanted to go to Syria. Now, with those 10 put on trial, so before I say that, now, again, it's a very useful provision. It's easy to prove, because ISIS is clearly a terrorist group. People post stuff on Facebook, so I'm going there, or they have like plane tickets. So it's not that hard to prove. But again, this is like a fairly low-level offense. The punishment is fairly low. It's not like 20 years. Of the 10 people, again, there's a variety. A number of people were put on trial, so they were indicted, but were not in Canada because they were presumed dead, but an arrest warrant was issued. Some trials are still ongoing. Some were convicted after a guilty plea, and one was convicted after a trial. But again, the persons who were convicted, they got 6 and 7 years. And one of them got 7 years, had already served 6 years, so has already spent 6 years in jail beforehand. So he get like bonus for that. So he's actually released in the summer of this year. Again, what do you do with this kind of people? Now, one thing he was ordered to do, he was ordered to enter a de-escalation program. They exist. There are a number of programs administered by the Canadian government where people either before they become interested in ISIS ideology or after they haven't been involved to actually try to bring them back on the right path, so to speak. So there's part of the court order. But he's out. He got the parole board gave him parole because he was a very good prisoner, so he's out right now. So what can we learn from all of this? As you can see, response internationally, domestically, have been all over the place. On one hand, domestically speaking, what's happening in Iraq right now is far from desirable, the way trials are being handled. On the other hand, dealing with those trials in countries in Europe and North America, they're slow, expensive, they're difficult, and you don't get most people. So then will our hopes be on the international side of it. The IIM has a limited mandate. The only thing that could be useful, in my view, is that if they get international tribunal started in Iraq with guarantees of a trial, international personnel, but in addition, have a division of labor. So far, the relationship with international tribunals and domestic courts has been one of basically barking up 2 different trees. Very little conversation, very little discussion, who should be doing what. There's been exchanging information, but even countries among themselves do not talk what they've been doing, let alone investigate together. I've been arguing for years now, what we should have is that a triple division of labor. Make sure that most of the crimes are done in the country where they occurred, but assist those countries in having a fair system. Having Rwanda, a number of countries, including specifically the Netherlands, spent millions of dollars to make the justice system in Rwanda much up to par international rights provisions. And that has worked. why not for Iraq? So have them there with fair trials and get a lot of people there tried and put in jail on humane conditions. Then you're left with the people who are either very serious offenders or can be tried somewhere else as foreign fighters. And then the very serious offenders should go to an international tribunal, in my view. So, those are my thoughts. I'm sure I've raised some questions and comments, so thank you for listening.
Rikhoff? Well, you've dealt with the symptoms of the civil war in Syria, and that's very important. What about the causes? Who are the major conflicting forces in Syria, and is there any prospect whatsoever of resolution?
I'm a lawyer, so my forte is not.
You're not.
But we have an expert here,
Okay.
but I will give a starting. I start with something. In 2011, there was this whole excitement about the Arab Spring happening. There were like very promising events happening in Tunisia, in Egypt, and Bahrain, and then also Syria, well, not Syria, but other countries as well. And Tunisia is an example of how it could be done. Tunisia had a quiet revolution, and the system there is much more democratic than it used to be. Not the way it's here, it's more democratic. And Syria and Libya became abject failures of the Arab Spring. So, I think that the causes, and again, you hear about, well, you know, someone like Saddam Hussein, who had terrible repression of minorities. But he said, if I don't do it this harsh way, they will rise up and make it worse, and there's something to be said for that. So, I don't know the answer. I mean, it's easy to say from our perspective, it should be more democratic institutions, more democratic approaches. But democracy can only be superimposed if a country is ready for culturally and sociologically speaking, which has been argued is not always the case, hasn't been the case in the Middle East. There's some books, I don't know if you ever read a book by a guy called Pinker. He talks about this, and he says, you know, there is a cycle. So there's like a way how human rights enforcement has been developed. And he talks about, it seems like if you look at history, you see that it's usually advanced in Western Europe, in North America, Australia, Japan, New Zealand. And you get the second wave, like South America, and then the last development is tend to be in the Middle East. In his view, like things have lagged behind as human rights. But do you want to comment on this?
Well, I'm a lawyer too, but I always tell my students, when I teach human rights in here, I always tell my students that we take human rights for granted in here. So it's not surprising that a state under pressure for more than 45 years, ruled by a family of, Al-Assad, who at the beginning came as in a military coup as well, there's a lack of education about politics, about citizenship, about democracy, about those are the main, about human rights, the main principles that we know and we function every day in Canada are lacking there. So it's not surprising that people uprised. And then of course they were influenced by the Arab Spring, but that was only an encouragement. But such movement happened in 2005 when Al-Assad, the son, came to power, and then he allowed diverse parties to act in Syria, and then one day, like after 2-3 weeks, just put everyone in jail. So it's the country, the history of the country can say about the repression of this family, and especially in 1985, where we know about Hamas with the Muslim Brotherhood incident, when there was no media coverage. The only one who was able to talk about it was Human Rights Watch, and that was in 2002 maybe, so probably 20-25 years after the coup, talking about the kind of killing that committed in there, regardless of if you agree or not, but we're talking from a human rights perspective. Being there for the first 19 months of the uprising and working with people of opinion and political and I would love to name them activists who uprised against al-Assad. It was totally a peaceful revolt, at least for the first 6 months. They were faced by weapons, killing, detention, torture, rape, and you name it. And this is something I worked on in Syria and I saw in my own eyes. And I have no interest in that at all because they nominated me to be on the MP there after the war. After the uprising, I was one of those lawyers who was Sunni from Damascene, came from a good family, so they wanted those personnel to be, with them. They actually offered me many positions that in the government I refused. I said I can't be with a bloody government. And that's why I left after probably 19 months from the uprising, but I saw that in my own eyes. I love to talk about the issue as whomever committed a crime is a criminal in Syria, but reportedly there are reports who would say that 59% of the crimes being committed in Syria are being committed by al-Assad party. So, academic speaking, statistic-wise, it's being committed by al-Assad. And that's why when we talk about al-Assad, we talk as the main perpetrator there. Now, of course, what do you do if they are, under repression for 2 years and you one day decided that no more, I want to stop that, and then they came and raped your wife or your mother in front of your eyes. You can expect that situation. And this is war. It's ugly. The war is really ugly. But I wouldn't give any justification for anyone who carried weapon in there. But I would say that, and also there was international influence for sure. Other countries wanted to intervene in the Syrian war. That's 100% sure. But also we have, as you said, to go to the roots and say why that happened at the beginning. But again, I'm a lawyer. I'm not gonna talk about things, but I'm just telling you, I'm highlighting stuff that I witnessed myself.
Yes. I think you mentioned that Iraq would be an appropriate place for stationing tribunals, but you also mentioned that the systems in Iraq, whether from the north to the south, is corrupt.
Yes.
Again, if really you want to establish tribunal in Iraq, are you going to try Shia militia that they have done worse than the ISIS against the Sunni?
Yeah, and you're right. You're completely right. The debate right now is saying, and there's a couple of considerations that have come up in the past as well, when choosing in a particular place. I mentioned Sierra Leone Special Court, right? They did try all the people, 10 of them, in Sierra Leone. But when they called Charles Taylor, the president of Liberia, who helped the RAF in Sierra Leone, it was deemed to be too dangerous, and they moved his trial to The Hague. So you look at political considerations. What it's saying is that if you put a tribunal in Iraq, and there has been a tribunal before in Iraq, by the way. There's been a tribunal, an international, sorry, let me rephrase that. There was a tribunal to put on trial Saddam Hussein and Kamel Ali and such, and they had international observers. It was all Iraqi personnel, but no international judges or prosecutors. And it was felt then that although the trials were not completely fair, including the death penalty, that the international observers being there did prevent the judges of being overly excessive. And I'm saying it very carefully because it's by no means ideal. But you're right, the way the Iraqi trials are being done by now with local judges is atrocious. It's terrible. But the idea is that if you put international tribunal there, as was done in Cambodia, and you make sure that you have international personnel being protected, together with national personnel, international personnel is the majority, which is also important for decision making, And when they put like ECC or Sierra Leone got in place, it was primarily done because it was felt by the United Nations you could not, you didn't say you could not really trust the local institutions. The same thing in East Timor after what happened there. You need a transitional period whereby you actually use international justice, international people to actually move the domestic institutions to a more mature stage. And that's what they're thinking about Iraq as well. Have an institution there, have international players, make sure that all the fair trial guarantees are being in place, and then hopefully that kind of permeates slowly into Iraqi institutions. Very wishful thinking in my view, but they say, what's the alternative? Like you can't put it in Syria right now, maybe in East Syria, but that has other legal consequences. You can't really put it maybe in Germany, because there's so many expatriates from Syria. But it's been debated. But every solution in terms of location has its own pros and cons. But Iraq is risky, right? The idea is that you put an institution there, and it actually will provide an example that will be followed by looking at it being done. And maybe now the fact that there have been so many demonstrations in Baghdad against corruption, maybe it is a good time to have the international push. Again, I don't know, but that's a debate right now. But it is a risky, very risky, I say probably, and it's riskier than it ever was before with other tribunals because there's still a war going on, right? And then you have Turkey interfering again in the north. It's a very unstable situation right now. But the question, the thing as well is the fact that all those ISIS, and again, do you talk about just ISIS or also the Assad people who, like I said, have been responsible for the majority of the crimes? The whole debate, could you start with ISIS people? Of course, they might be the most easy because they're already detained, maybe easy to prove. And when they don't, then it morphs into the tribunal dealing with the Assad regime. You deal with Russia, of course, what they think. It's extremely complicated, and I do not envy the people who are trying to fix that. So I can give you a better answer than that.
I think in my view, ISIS, they have come scapegoat. Everybody is actually ready, okay, put them in trials, but actually other countries, they are benefiting from. There are many reports that actually during the Syrian war, which as you mentioned, that was a peaceful movement that was morphed into these confrontations. Those areas that ISIS were locating, Syrian and Iranian forces, they did not fight with them. They were fighting with real oppositions.
Yeah. Well, I also understand that the original ISIS leadership were basically Sunni military from the Iraqi army. Right? So yeah, I think what galvanizes the international opinion is one, ISIS has been not only extremely brutal, because Al-Assad have been very brutal as well with chemical weapons, but it actually advertised it. Everybody knows about it because they did it like in very gory detail. Plus, they have taken responsibility for terrorist attacks in Europe and North America, and that hits home, literally. So I think those two things probably mitigates to sort of do ISIS first, so to speak.
This might not be related to the question that I mentioned. This is one of the major problems with that regions. If we can find a way, because in Iran, Iraq, Syria, those countries, whenever there is really a real desire, tendency by the people for freedom, right away they can be depicted as
terrorists.
Foreigners, they have a hand. And right away the government can be carved out.
Yeah.
But
You're right.
we can overcome that problem. That is why I have realized that, in my view, the Western media, particularly the left-leaning media, they have been a godsend for those dictators. Because the way they depict those as if these are there because the West and the imperialist forces, they have pushed these people to communist state, where that people actually, they have the real desire for freedom as we enjoy here.
I know the narrative. The narrative on the left-wing side His mind was equally better on the right-wing side. The right-wing narrative, like when the United States was supporting regimes in Central South America, was for a couple of reasons. The left wing looked like very doctrinally and what they want to achieve, and if like the group that's supporting is trying to achieve it as well, that's fine. I know when I was growing up in Holland, I knew people in the Maoist party who were like in Holland defending China because that was the ideology. So no matter how you get at the end result, that is fine. Well, that's not fine. I mean, to me, the underlying thing should always be I look at human rights as part of the narrative. And that is, if you have like people on each extreme right, it's being lost in the ideology, unfortunately. You had a comment as well about it?
Yeah, no, I have questions.
Oh, sure.
Okay, so there is one, talking about Canada, you were right about the kind of, process that the Canadian government approached to bring Syrian refugees to Canada. But we also know that many of the rich people